The SG radar played a vital role in the second stage of the naval clash at Guadalcanal, which unfolded on November 14 and 15, 1942. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, often regarded as one of the Navy's sharpest minds despite criticism from rivals, stood out for his technical expertise and quick thinking under pressure. During the interwar period, Lee directed fleet training and strongly supported the modernization of America's warships. His specialty was radar, and he understood it so thoroughly that he often knew more about its workings than the operators themselves. His faith in this new and still largely untested technology proved invaluable during the critical night north of Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Theater, sent Lee and his six-ship task force to intercept another Japanese attempt to disable Henderson Field. Just one day earlier, on November 13th, Admiral Daniel J. Callahan's force of cruisers and destroyers had successfully repelled Japanese battleships and cruisers, though Callahan was killed in the fight and 6 of his ships were lost. The survivors were in no condition to withstand another assault. Lee, leading Task Force 64 with 2 battleships, South Dakota and Washington, supported by 4 destroyers, was ordered to block the new Japanese force. That afternoon, a Japanese scout plane spotted the Americans about 100 miles south of Guadalcanal, but mistakenly identified the battleships as cruisers with escorts. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's fleet was advancing southward toward the island. At around 4:30 p.m., the submarine Flying Fish sighted Kondo's ships and fired torpedoes at the cruiser Otago, though all missed. Still, the submarine's clear report to intelligence described Kondo's fleet, centered on the battleship Kirishima, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. With this warning, Lee knew he faced a formidable opponent. As he advanced toward Guadalcanal's western coast, his formation placed 4 destroyers, Walker, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn at the front, followed by South Dakota and Washington, his flagship. Halsey had given him freedom to arrange his ships as he thought best, and Lee chose to guard the approaches between Cape Esperance and Savo Island off Guadalcanal's northwest coast. This knowledge of the enemy's approach gave him an edge, though he faced the challenge of leading ships that had never operated together. The 4 destroyers, drawn from separate divisions, were chosen simply because they were the only nearby vessels with enough fuel, while the 2 battleships were on their first joint mission. Having sailed as a group for only a day, Lee ordered a 5,000-yard gap between the destroyers and the battleships to reduce the risk of collision in the narrow seas. At about 9 p.m. on November 14th, Lee ordered the column to turn 90 degrees, passing Savo Island and entering Ironbottom Sound, a body of water once called Savo Sound, renamed after the many ships sunk there since August. Lee knew the Japanese were closing in, but he lacked fresh intelligence. His task force had departed Espiritu Santo without an assigned radio call sign, and when he tried contacting Guadalcanal's station, codenamed Cactus, he was curtly told, "We do not recognize you." Lee tried again, invoking his Naval Academy friend General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, by sending, "This is Lee. Tell General Vandegrift, class of 1908, Chain Lee, asks for the latest information." The nickname Ching Lee, given to him at the academy, became the key to avoiding disaster. Around this time, radio operators aboard Washington overheard nearby PT boats debating whether Lee's 2 large ships were enemy vessels just before preparing to launch torpedoes. To prevent a deadly mistake, Lee quickly sent colorful messages that would unmistakably identify him to Vandegrift. One version in rhyme read, "This is Ching Lee. Don't shoot torpedoes at me." Another message stated more plainly, "Tell your commander this is Ching Lee." A third stripped it down further. "Inform your boss, Ching Lee. American, not Japanese." His unusual transmission succeeded. The PT boats stood down, convinced that the 2 big ships were friendly, not enemy battleships. Thanks to his unusual identity messages, Ching Lee avoided being mistakenly attacked, though he still received no fresh details on Admiral Kondo's advancing fleet. After 10:30, Cactus finally answered, saying their commander had no new intelligence to share. While Lee was busy trying to get updates, Kondo divided his 14 ships into 3 elements. One group, led by the light cruiser Nagara, and including 6 destroyers, Shirayuki, Hatsuyuki, Samidare, Inazuma, Asagumo, and Teruzuki, was sent forward. Another, under the light cruiser Sendai with 3 destroyers, Uranami, Shikinami, and Ayanami, was ordered east of Savo Island. Kondo's own flagship Atago, her sister Takao, and the battleship Kirishima made up the main bombardment force tasked with striking Henderson Field. 9 more destroyers screened the operation, while 4 transports carried reinforcements to Guadalcanal. The plan was straightforward. Kirishima's guns would shell Henderson Field, while the transports unloaded soldiers, and any American ships that tried to interfere would be intercepted by the cruiser and destroyer groups. At 10:10, Sendai's operators first picked up Lee's ships northeast of Savo heading into Ironbottom Sound, reporting 2 American cruisers with 4 destroyers. Kondo immediately ordered an attack, sending Sendai and Shikinami to intercept, while Nagara with 4 destroyers raced in at high speed. Meanwhile, Kirishima and the 2 heavy cruisers advanced to complete the bombardment. At 10:52, Lee, having reached the southern end of his course along Guadalcanal, turned his 6 ships west. Minutes later, Washington's SG radar detected Sendai about 9 miles away, tracking it until 11:12 when South Dakota and Washington's directors finally gained visual contact. "Open fire when ready," Lee commanded. Washington's advanced SG radar, far superior to the older SC sets still in use, gave the Americans a crucial edge. The earlier SC equipment, introduced just before Pearl Harbor, had often betrayed U.S. positions by broadcasting signals the Japanese could pick up, effectively exposing American ships instead of finding the enemy. SG radar, using shorter wavelengths, avoided this flaw, and even the most skeptical officers knew it was a leap forward. At 11:17, Washington opened up with her 16-inch guns, lighting the sky with star shells from her 5-inch batteries to mark the targets nearly 18,000 yards north. The heavy shells splashed close to Sendai and her escorts, but none scored a hit. Aboard South Dakota, radio men could hear excited chatter among Japanese crews. Soon, the destroyer Shikinami disappeared behind a smokescreen as Rear Admiral Hashimoto maneuvered Sendai north, while Uranami and Ayanami pressed south toward Lee's line. At 11:23, Walker, leading the American column, fired her 5-inch guns, quickly followed by Benham and Preston. Preston soon found herself trading blows with Nagara and its screening destroyers. Within minutes, she was struck repeatedly, her boiler room disabled, and her aft stack toppled, while fire and wreckage engulfed her rear gun mounts. Another hit crippled the engine room. Although the gunnery officer tried to keep the forward guns firing, Preston was doomed. Listing to starboard and sinking stern first, she was abandoned at 11:36, just 14 minutes after opening fire, and rolled over within moments. Crewmen on nearby Gwyn watched helplessly as their sister ship went down under heavy enemy fire. Gwyn had to veer hard to avoid the wreck. The gray backdrop of Savo Island and the Japanese use of flashless powder further concealed their movements. But their most devastating weapon was yet to come. The Type 93 long Lance Torpedo. This formidable weapon was 30 feet long, 2 feet in diameter, and carried a 1,180-pound warhead. It could run an incredible 22,000 yards, about 11 nautical miles, at nearly 50 knots. By comparison, the U.S. Navy's Mark 14 torpedo carried a smaller 825-pound warhead, had a maximum range of only 6,000 yards, and was powered by compressed air, leaving a visible wake. The long Lance, fueled by pure oxygen, produced almost no trail while delivering superior speed, range, and destructive power, making it the Imperial Navy's most feared tool on cruisers and destroyers. The torpedoes were fired from 24-inch deck tubes that could be reloaded quickly, effectively doubling the number of war shots a ship could throw. At 11:30 p.m., one destroyer opened with her long lances. 5 minutes later, the others followed, and the formation turned to port. About 11:38. Walker took a torpedo hit, probably from one of the Japanese destroyers, and the forward magazines blew up, the resulting blast shearing away everything ahead of the bridge. With power and communications lost, Walker sank bow first, and as she went down, her scuttling charges detonated, killing men in the water. Benham was struck near the bow by another torpedo that made a large hole but failed to sink her. She altered course to evade enemy fire and limped on at roughly 10 knots, remaining afloat despite 3 shell hits. Gwynn avoided torpedoes by an evasive turn. Preston's torpedo safety links were broken by a hit, letting torpedoes slide harmlessly out of their tubes into the sea. There were reciprocal casualties, and Washington then opened up on a Japanese destroyer, hitting her repeatedly until she burned and sank. The muzzle flashes revealed her position against Savo Island's gray silhouette, though her sister ships managed to keep reloading and stayed in the fight undamaged. Lee's quartet of destroyer escorts had suffered most. Benham and Gwynn were badly damaged but afloat, while Preston and Walker went down. As one chronicler observed, they took the heaviest punishment, yet carried out their duty, sacrificing themselves while shielding South Dakota and Washington from gunfire and torpedoes. At about 11:48, Lee ordered Benham and Gwynn to withdraw, leaving only the 2 battleships. Even before the destroyers had cleared, South Dakota suffered a stroke of bad luck when her circuit breakers tripped and plunged. The ship into darkness. Lights and radar screens went dead. An outage Captain Thomas Gatch, later described as deeply dispiriting for officers and crew. Power was restored after 6 minutes, 11:30, 11:36, but the radar picture remained incomplete and the SG set was reported inoperative, which hampered station keeping and target detection and left the ship feeling effectively blind. To make matters worse, South Dakota had turned to starboard rather than port to avoid the sinking destroyers, putting her squarely in the path of the approaching Japanese ships. Once darkened and silhouetted by flames, she became an inviting target for enemy gunners and torpedo teams. Radar picked up an enemy destroyer fewer than 3 miles away, and Kondo did not visually identify South Dakota until about 11:58, when several of his ships, most notably the heavy cruiser Otago and another cruiser, fired torpedoes and trained searchlights on her. Under the glare, lookouts could no longer mistake her for a cruiser. Her massive superstructure and tall fore-tower revealed her true identity. Although the torpedoes missed, the shelling was severe. In under 4 minutes, South Dakota took some 26 hits. One gun report estimated the hits as one 5-inch, 6 6-inch, 18 8-inch, and one 14-inch strike, while another account suggested her armor may have taken 2 14-inch hits, even as the topside was shredded by numerous 8-inch and 5.5-inch shells. Several projectiles failed to detonate. The exploding rounds produced thunderous crashes, followed by the metallic sizzle of fragments tearing through cables, guns, and the superstructure. Despite the official claim that damage was largely superficial, an assistant gunnery officer aboard Kirishima insisted they had struck South Dakota repeatedly and inflicted serious harm. Damage control parties worked amid wreckage and the 39 bodies recovered from the decks, fighting fires and making emergency repairs until Captain Gatch concluded his ship could no longer help stop Kondo's bombardment and requested permission to withdraw. Admiral Lee approved just after midnight on November 15th. With South Dakota retiring, Washington was left alone to face Kondo's heavy units, what historian Samuel Eliot Morison later called a one-ship task force. A situation that might have imperiled Lee's flagship, but for luck. Kondo's lookouts had become fixated on the brightly lit South Dakota, and in the scramble they failed to notice Washington only 400 yards away, a fact that made Admiral Lee keenly aware of how narrowly disaster had been avoided. The Japanese task force prepared to throw its full strength at Kirishima, the largest unit in Admiral Kondo's group, and the clash that followed between the American battleship Washington and the Japanese ship resembled the brutal contest of 2 heavyweight boxers striking each other in a darkened arena. A year and a half earlier, a British author had described the meeting of Bismarck and Hood as a duel between armored knights armed with cannons instead of lances, and the comparison was equally fitting here. Washington possessed a decisive advantage through her modern SG radar, which could detect targets clearly even in the pitch black. But to aid visual observation, one of her 5-inch batteries also fired a star shell, briefly illuminating Kirishima and providing additional clarity for the lookouts. Even so, her radar crews struggled with a delicate technical complication. South Dakota, her sister ship, was positioned in Washington's radar blind spot off the starboard quarter and did not appear on the screens. For a moment, Admiral Lee feared that the large target showing on the radar might actually be South Dakota, and he hesitated to open fire until he was absolutely sure he would not be striking his own vessel. Only after confirming South Dakota's exact location did he give the order to unleash Washington's heavy guns. At the stroke of midnight, the battleship erupted in fury. All 9 barrels of her 16-inch main battery and 2 of her 5-inch mounts roared toward Kirishima, while other 5-inch turrets targeted Otago. The Americans fired armor-piercing shells designed to punch through hull plating, burrow deep into the enemy's body, and explode inside, tearing through bulkheads and decks. In stark contrast, Kondo's ships fired high-explosive shells with impact fuses, weapons intended to smash airfields and barracks at Henderson Field rather than pierce a battleship's armored skin. This mismatch in ammunition meant Washington's blows were devastating, while the Japanese return fire was ill-suited to disabling heavy warships. Washington's shells streaked across the dark sea at more than 2,600 feet per second, reaching Kirishima in less than a minute. To the Japanese sailors watching from her decks, the sight of Washington's blinding muzzle flashes must have been terrifying, as they knew gigantic projectiles were already in the air and descending upon them. A storm of white geysers erupted around the ship as the shells struck water, towers of spray leaping above her superstructure until she was nearly hidden from view. It was not all near misses. Washington's gunnery officer later wrote that the first salvo probably struck home, and the second certainly did. Very quickly, Kirishima was hammered by a rain of 16-inch and 5-inch shells that tore into her structure. Her steering system jammed. Multiple fires raged in her superstructure and deep below decks. Flooding spread as compartments beneath the waterline were torn open, and 2 of her turrets were knocked out of action. The American gunnery officer noted that although they still walked salvos back and forth across the target with optical checks, radar provided constant precision, particularly for the secondary battery, which was guided entirely by radar for at least 5 minutes. Admiral Lee, who had long advocated for radar since its introduction to the fleet, was gratified to see his faith rewarded. A naval historian later remarked that within only 7 minutes Kirishima had been reduced to a burning wreck, her upper works aflame, and her steering hopelessly ruined. Kirishima's assistant gunnery officer gave his own grim testimony, stating that their ship's steering was destroyed beyond repair, that they were left circling helplessly, and that engine maneuvers could not free them. By his account, the battleship took about 40 hits from rapid-firing 5-inch guns and around 9 solid strikes from Washington's 16-inch weapons. He admitted the engines were not fatally crippled, but emphasized the pounding from Washington's batteries was unrelenting. Washington ceased fire exactly 7 minutes after opening the duel, just past midnight, having effectively removed Kirishima from the fight. Although Kirishima was neutralized, Kondo still commanded a formidable body of ships. About 6 destroyers remained to the west of Savo Island, supported by heavy cruisers Otago, Takao, Nagara, and Sendai. Concerned about his transports, Kondo decided to lessen the bombardment of Henderson Field and redirected some destroyers to strike at Washington. Barely 13 minutes after Washington had silenced Kirishima, she had altered course to the north-northwest, and soon torpedoes were streaking toward her. Oyashio fired her spread around 0040, with other destroyers launching long-range Lance torpedoes within minutes, and Otago loosed 3 more. Lookouts aboard Washington reported that several passed dangerously close, though none found their mark. By 0:45, Kondo concluded it was no longer practical to remain near Savo and ordered his vessels to withdraw after firing. Those not engaged were told to retreat entirely. His ships vanished behind a thick smoke screen, a maneuver Admiral Lee observed with satisfaction. Yet even as they pulled back, 2 Japanese destroyers fired one last spread of torpedoes toward Washington, and at least 2 detonated in her turbulent wake. Washington remained the last American ship in the battle area, finally withdrawing about 15 minutes after South Dakota had left. The destroyer Benham, escorted by Gwin, limped toward Espiritu Santo, but was too badly damaged to survive. On the afternoon of November 15th, her crew was evacuated to Gwin. which attempted to sink her with torpedoes, but when these either failed or missed, Gwyn's guns finally delivered the coup de grace before carrying the survivors safely to port. Washington and South Dakota reached Espiritu Santo together. From there, South Dakota sailed to the United States for extensive repairs and a full overhaul. The Japanese destroyer Ayanami also did not survive, though she was abandoned rather than scuttled. Her crew was removed shortly after 02, and she slipped beneath the waves. Kirishima, meanwhile, still floated but barely. Her speed was reduced to a crawl, and she continued to take in water through ruptures below the waterline. Her captain, recognizing that the ship could not steer and that the engines were faltering, gave the order to scuttle. The Kingston valves were opened, the Emperor's portrait was ceremonially transferred to another vessel, and Kirishima slowly settled beneath the waters west of Savo Island. The sinking took around 2.5 hours. Destroyers managed to rescue about a quarter of her crew, while the rest abandoned ship and were picked up from the sea. At 03:25 on November 15th, the proud battleship finally disappeared beneath the surface, taking about 250 of her 1,400 men with her. Almost half a century later, in the summer of 1992, ocean explorer Robert Ballard discovered the wreck 11 miles west of Savo. On the seabed, he found Kirishima completely capsized, her superstructure buried in the mud with only the bottom of her hull visible. Her rudders and propellers jutted from the sea floor, suggesting she had rolled over after becoming top-heavy with her towering pagoda mast. Ballard also saw that her bow had broken away, evidence of a catastrophic magazine explosion after her sinking. Even though both fleets had pulled back, the naval struggle for Guadalcanal was not finished. Japanese reinforcement transports were instructed to beach themselves on the island's northern shore so troops could disembark directly. Admiral Tanaka's transports, Yamura Maru, Hako Maru, Kinugasa Maru, and Sangetsu Maru grounded near Tasafaronga by 04 Ido. But at dawn, they were spotted by Henderson Field aircraft and Enterprise carrier planes, which commenced relentless attacks. Strafing runs and bombings lasted until mid-afternoon, aided by destroyer gunfire, and by day's end, the 4 transports were wrecked. The sea was littered with wreckage, sacks of rice, boxes of ammunition, and bodies. Only about 2,000 soldiers made it ashore from the 6,000+ who had embarked. After the 2 days of combat, both sides claimed major victories. Japanese reports exaggerated American losses, sometimes insisting 8 destroyers had been sunk and 2 capital ships crippled, while American announcements inflated Japanese damage, boasting of numerous cruisers, destroyers, and even a battleship destroyed. In truth, the Japanese had lost Kirishima and a destroyer, while Lee's force had suffered the loss of Benham and heavy damage to South Dakota. Still, Lee had achieved his essential aim. Henderson Field had not been silenced, Japanese reinforcements were crippled, and enemy confidence was shaken. The Japanese command began to doubt the wisdom of persisting with the Guadalcanal campaign, recognizing that unlike the Americans, they could not easily replace lost ships and transports. One historian noted that the Japanese Navy grew increasingly reluctant to contest the surrounding waters, though the Imperial Army clung to Guadalcanal for 10 more weeks. Admiral Lee, reflecting later, understood why he had prevailed. He admitted that in terms of training, skill, and seamanship, the Americans were not necessarily superior to their opponents, but emphasized that the advantage lay in technology. Radar had given Washington her edge in the chaos of a night battle, and he stated